When I was still in high school, I decided I wanted to learn about philosophy, and I did what I think a lot of people would think is natural. I went to a bookstore and then I just found some books that I wanted to read. Of course, that meant that when I came home, I had two books, and it was The Birth of Tragedy by Friedrich Nietzsche and Introduction to Metaphysics by Martin Heidegger. If you know anything about philosophy, I think you know that that was probably not the ideal way to start. I didn't have any sense of like what basic terms meant. I just knew that philosophy sounded like something that was interesting and something I wanted to spend some time on, but I was going in totally blind. So if you're in a position where you want to start reading some philosophy, but you don't even know what the basic landscape of philosophy is like, this is the video for you. This is my sort of beginner's guide to philosophy. This is not a list of recommended readings. I've done that a couple of times. I'll link them down below. Instead, this is a tour through 5 major areas of philosophy. And those areas are logic, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and political philosophy. Now, if you're someone who would click on a video like this, it's because you like to learn things, and you probably like to learn things in a free and easy way. And I want to take just a moment to tell you about today's sponsor, Brilliant. Brilliant is a great way for you to learn about math and computer science. You can work on general science and engineering skills, some of those programming skills you've been wanting to develop, or maybe some data analytics. And Brilliant sets this up so that you can learn these things in about 15 minutes a day. I left academia after getting my PhD, started working at tech companies. And one of the things I didn't learn to do when I was working on my philosophy PhD was learn about data analytics or to learn skills like Python. And those kind of skills, though, are incredibly useful if you're trying to branch out. Now, if you're interested in Brilliant, they are offering a 20% discount to the first 200 subscribers who use my link. That is brilliant.org/Jared Henderson. That's 20% off for the first 200 subscribers. And you get a 30-day free trial with Brilliant. So thank you again to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Now, when I talk about philosophy, I usually like to start by talking about logic. The study of logic can be broken up really into 2 major categories. The first category is about the art of thinking and about becoming a better thinker. One of the best examples of that from the history of philosophy is this 17th century book by Arnaud and Nicole called Logic or the Art of Thinking. This book was actually intended as a kind of manual to help you become a more rational thinker. Arnaud and Nicole are trying to help the reader train themselves so that they can have more true beliefs while also avoiding false beliefs. And there's a lot of value in what Arnaud and Nicole are trying to do. You could go and try and read that book yourself, but I think most of us would probably want a bit more of a modern update. And this is really the topic that you would find discussed in textbooks that fall under the heading of critical thinking. And if you've spent any time on the internet around philosophy or critical thinking, then you've probably encountered a couple of the basic concepts, like fallacies. You might have even seen a YouTube video where someone tried to give a quick list of 19 fallacies and also accidentally said that Richard Nixon walks on the moon, and the comment section let him know that he made a mistake. Who knew? Fallacies, really simply put, are bad patterns of reasoning. It's not that every fallacious argument has a wrong or false conclusion. It's that the kind of reasoning that's being employed in a fallacious argument is not the kind of reasoning that will reliably take you from truth to truth. So here's a quick example. This is the fallacy of guilt by association. This is probably the internet's favorite fallacy. So suppose that we have 2 friends, Arthur and Buster, and they've decided to have a debate about vaccines. Suppose that Arthur holds the belief that vaccines cause autism. Now, Arthur is wrong about this, and Buster needs to figure out how he can argue against Arthur and try to convince him. One of the ways he could do this is talk about the different studies that show that there really isn't much evidence that supports any kind of causal link between vaccines and autism. But sometimes Buster maybe gets a little ahead of himself, and he says instead that you shouldn't believe that because crazy and bad people like Alex Jones believe that. Notice here that even if Buster is correct about vaccines not causing autism, he's still made a bad argument. The truth is that bad people, and sometimes even crazy people, have true beliefs. So just associating a belief with a bad person isn't enough to show that the belief is false. The point is pretty simple. If you want to figure out if a belief is true or false, you need to focus on the relevant kind of evidence. And just like the fact that good people believe something doesn't make it true, bad people believing something also doesn't make it false. So if you understand logic this way, I think you can see how it's going to help make you a better thinker. You're going to learn about good reasoning, whether deductive, inductive, or abductive. And you don't really need to use formal logical tools in order to learn this stuff. It can also go really nicely with some more modern psychology. In the last couple of decades, psychologists have become very interested in cognitive biases. Now, some of the research on cognitive biases proved to not be nearly as robust as we had previously believed, particularly the work on implicit bias that really did not hold up to replication. But there are still well-documented and well-supported cognitive biases, which are basically these bad heuristics that we tend to naturally do in order to determine if something is true or false. Learning about cognitive biases is a lot like learning about fallacies. The more you learn about them, the more you can try and recognize them in your own thinking, and the better kind of thinker you're going to become. And this is going to help you when you're studying philosophy, but it's also really going to help you when you study absolutely anything. This is one of the reasons that I bring it up at the beginning of this video, and why I think it's an important way to start your philosophical journey. Now, the second way of understanding logic is as a formal or mathematical system. We have a precedent of this in the history of philosophy as well. While formal mathematical logic really becomes its own kind of subject in maybe, say, the 19th century, in the medieval world, we had incredibly robust logical analysis. And medieval logicians were really worried about the structure of argument in the way that contemporary mathematical logicians are. Even if you go back to Aristotle, we're talking about the form of argument rather than the content of argument, which is that first distinction you need if you're going to study formal logic. When most philosophers today talk about logic, they are talking about formal logic, so logic in our second sense, and not that first sense in making you a better thinker. So the study of formal logic really started to flourish in the 19th and 20th centuries. And one of the key figures for this is Gottlob Frege. Frege was the inventor of something called the Begriffsschrift. This translates to a concept script from German. His idea was to create a formal notation which could represent arguments, especially the kinds of arguments that you would find in mathematics. So logicians would actually translate arguments into this formal representation, and then using well-defined rules try to assess whether or not they were valid or invalid. It can feel tedious to try to spell out all of these rules, but this level of precision is useful for the sort of work that logicians want to do. Formal logic really originally was supposed to provide a grounding for all of mathematics, but this actually proved a little bit difficult due to things like Russell's paradox and Gödel's incompleteness theorem. So Russell's paradox showed an essential contradiction in Frege's system. It actually showed that Frege made inconsistent assumptions as he was laying out his entire formal system. And then Gödel's incompleteness theorem shows that there are some truths of mathematics which cannot be proven. But formal logic is not only useful because it could provide a grounding for mathematics. It's also useful for our kind of precise modeling of other philosophically interesting concepts. And that's why we have modal logics, temporal logics, epistemic logics, fuzzy logics, and so on. Some philosophers also spend their time thinking about paradoxes. And a paradox is where we get an absurd conclusion from plausibly true premises and reliable inference rules. They seem to show us that there's a problem with the way we think about reasoning. Here's a famous example, the liar's paradox. So consider the sentence, "This sentence is false." Now let's ask ourselves an obvious question. So is that sentence true or false? If you say that it's false, then the sentence is true, because after all, it says of itself that it's false, and it's false, so it's true. That's absurd, right? But if it is true, then we get the inverse reasoning. Since it says of itself that it's false, and we've supposed that it's true, then it actually describes itself incorrectly. And a sentence that describes itself incorrectly is false, which again is absurd. The liar traps us in a kind of pattern of circular reasoning. We can go back and forth concluding that it's true, and then it's false, and it's true, and then it's false. And if you accept some common inference rules like modus ponens, you actually get to this principle called explosion. The idea behind the principle of explosion is that when you've arrived at a contradiction, you can actually prove any sentence at all. And that obviously is absurd. Not every sentence is true. So paradoxes tell us something important, but actually figuring out what they tell us about our language or about our logic is a matter of debate. I didn't even bother to count how many different kinds of solutions to the paradoxes there are on offer, but I would guess probably in the hundreds, at least when it comes to theories, when you look at all the variants and subvariants of the solutions. So to say that there's any kind of consensus, I think, would be an overstatement. So logicians study good thinking and the laws of logic. But metaphysicians study the nature of reality itself. Metaphysicians debate topics like truth, identity, endurance, necessity, contingency, the existence of God, the relationship between the mental and the physical. Those are just the topics that I could think of off the top of my head, actually. For a short video like this, we're just going to focus on two of the big issues that we've seen in the history of philosophy, and those are the nature of truth and the problem of universals. So probably from the very beginning of philosophy, philosophers have felt like they had to say something about truth and to tell you what it is. But for a very long time, they never felt like they had to go into tremendous detail. Truth was sort of just taken for granted as a kind of obvious or simple concept. So they didn't actually tell us much about the nature of truth. There's a quote from Aristotle in the Metaphysics where he gives a little definition of truth that actually is pretty straightforward. So Aristotle writes, "To say of what is that it is not, or of what is not that it is false. While to say of what it is that it is, and of what is not that it is true." Aristotle seems to have inherited that definition from Plato, and basically he's just giving you the conditions under which something is true or false. That doesn't actually tell us much about the nature of the property of truth, and eventually philosophers felt like they had to give a theory of truth. And a couple of theories emerged as like the main contenders. The correspondence theory of truth says that a sentence is true when it corresponds to reality. This seems to be really similar to what Plato and Aristotle would have said about truth. This view is often associated with another view in metaphysics called realism, which is the belief that there are mind-independent truths. So truths that we don't make true with our minds, but rather we discover. I would say that probably this is the most popular view of truth. Most philosophers would defend this view, including me, by the way. I wrote my dissertation on the nature of truth, and I did not start off wanting to defend a correspondence theory. I had alternative ideas, but by the end, I ended up offering a kind of novel version of a correspondence theory of truth in my dissertation. So I do have some skin in this game. The verification theory of truth says that a sentence is true when it has been verified. The verification theory is often associated with anti-realism. And according to this view, before something has been verified, it's neither true nor false. This view was actually pretty popular in the 20th century, partly due to the influence of a philosopher named Michael Dummett, but it was never really the dominant view. Related to the verification theory of truth is the pragmatist theory of truth, which says that when we say a belief is true, what we're really saying is that it's useful for achieving our practical ends. This does seem like another anti-realist theory of truth, but it has nothing to do with verification in this case. And it's more about the utility of certain beliefs. This is closely associated with the American pragmatists like C.S. Peirce and William James and John Dewey. The final prominent theory of truth would be the coherence theory, which says that a sentence is true just when it coheres with some privileged set of beliefs. Now, this view is associated with another metaphysical view called idealism. Idealism is the view that all of reality fundamentally is mental. Idealism is closely associated with a lot of different German philosophers, probably most famously Kant and Hegel. And a coherence theory of truth has been attributed to Hegel, though I have read some scholarly work that disputes whether or not Hegel actually has a coherence theory of truth. But there are later idealists, like the British idealist F.H. Bradley, who seems to definitely hold a coherence theory of truth. And then you have to mention this one weird view that popped up in the 20th century, but has really been prominent in discussions of truth since then. And that's the deflationary theory of truth. This theory of truth really took off, I think, with the logical positivist and is associated with a book called Language, Truth, and Logic by A.J. Ayer, but has also been defended by philosophers like Paul Horwich and a bunch of others in the 20th century. And the deflationist theory of truth says that truth isn't a property that has a nature. They deflate the whole concept. And in fact, truth is kind of like the word and. It plays a logical or functional role in our language, but it doesn't pick out anything significant in the world. Now that's a quick introduction to truth, so let's move on really quickly to talk about universals. So we can divide the world into two categories, individuals and universals. We'll actually use some examples to make this a little bit clearer, and let's talk about my cats. So I have two black cats, Carl and Bark. Yes, the second one is named Bark, like the sound a dog makes. My wife thought it would be funny. So both Carl and Bark are individuals. So they are discrete and distinct things. They exist out in the world. We could be more specific and say they are concrete individuals. So they're distinct things that we can interact with physically and directly. But they also seem to have some things in common, namely they're both black and they're both cats. So when we say that they're both cats, what we're doing is classifying Carl and Bark. We're saying that they both belong to this common class of cats. And there are things that are not in the class of cats, like this bottle. If you're a certain kind of philosopher, you might ask, why is that? For some philosophers, the answer is that Carl and Bark both instantiate a common property, which we'll call a universal. And that is they both instantiate or participate in the universal of cat. Well, let's call it cattiness. Carl and Bark both instantiate the universal of being a cat, and this bottle doesn't. That explains why two of them are cats and one of them isn't. The idea that there are these universals is closely associated with Plato, who gave his theory of forms. So forms are just Plato's word for universals. For Plato, the forms are timeless and eternal and unchanging, and they live in this kind of other realm. We actually call it the Platonic realm in philosophy. So the Platonic forms are actually treated as abstract objects. Now, Aristotle actually agreed that there were universals, but he disagreed that they had to exist abstractly. Instead, he thought that they existed in the objects which instantiated them. So Plato and Aristotle both agree that there are universals. They just disagree about the details of the theory. But there are some philosophers who say that there's no such thing as universals or properties, and maybe they even go further and say no such thing as abstract objects. And we call those philosophers nominalists. So some philosophers base their arguments for nominalism based on a principle of simplicity, which basically says that we should prefer simpler theories if they do the same kind of explanatory work. This is closely associated with a principle of reasoning that we sometimes call Occam's razor, which is associated with the medieval philosopher William of Ockham. Now, William of Ockham was a nominalist, but as this article in the Stanford Encyclopedia makes clear, he does not base his argument on his razor, this principle. Instead, William of Ockham wanted to argue directly against the existence of universals. He didn't just think that universals were unnecessary, he thought that universals were incoherent. Eventually, Occam says that the only sense in which something universal exists is when there is an act of the mind which thinks of two or more objects. And this is roughly what nominalists tend to say about properties and things. Properties don't exist in the objects or in another realm. They only exist insofar as we sort of make them up as we're classifying objects. So you can find nominalism throughout the history of philosophy and not just in Western philosophy. This is a case where Buddhism is a pretty interesting example. A lot of Buddhist philosophers say that everything is temporary and nothing is eternal. And if everything is temporary and nothing is eternal, then there can't be any kind of universals which exist in some other realm. Certainly the Platonic theory of universals just can't be true because, again, those are supposed to be timeless and unchanging and eternal. If universals are timeless, but everything is temporary, then universals just don't exist. So let's talk about epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. It comes from this Greek word episteme. One of the fundamental questions of epistemology is, what is knowledge? What is the definition or nature of knowledge? And one very old theory, again, can be traced back to Plato. Sometimes we call this theory the JTB theory of knowledge. This theory says that knowledge is justified, true belief. I said this theory could be traced back to Plato, and that's because it's put forward by one of the characters in his dialogue, the Theaetetus. Many philosophers have accepted some version of the JTB theory, but they've typically argued over the nature of justification. And then we also find arguments directly against the JTB theory. In the 20th century, the famous example of this is Edmund Getier's paper. Gettier wrote a paper which outlined a series of cases where the JTB theory would be satisfied, but where we wouldn't say that the people in question knew anything. And mostly all of his cases centered on a kind of epistemic luck. They had justification for their beliefs, and it was true, but the alignment of that justification and the truth, it's just really kind of a matter of luck. And we say that, oh, you just got lucky. It actually really is about as worthwhile as having a lucky guess, and thus we don't want to say that you really know it. And so the JTB theory is at best insufficient. Especially in the English-speaking world, we've come to call these sorts of cases the Gettier problem. There is one major problem with this, and that's that Gettier didn't actually invent the problem. There seems to be evidence that an Indian philosopher in the 8th century, Dharmottara, actually raises similar kinds of problems for roughly this theory of knowledge. And there's a similar point that's raised by the 14th century Italian philosopher, Peter of Mantua. But there is a more fundamental epistemological problem. And that's the question of whether or not it's possible to know anything at all. Some philosophers throughout history have argued the answer is no. We call them skeptics. When we call them skeptics, we mean something very different than the modern usage of the term. For some reason, we've decided to call people skeptics if they are basically Richard Dawkins-style new atheist or something. Skeptics in the philosophical tradition are typically significantly more radical. Philosophical skeptics tend to deny the possibility of knowledge. One problem that you face if you claim that knowledge is impossible is that someone can ask the kind of smart-alecky question, do you know that? If you answer yes, then you've contradicted your own position because you've said knowledge is impossible, but in fact you know something. And if you say no, then it seems like you've undermined your own position because you've actually said that you don't even believe it. This is why skeptics tend to actually try to hedge their position. The Pyrrhonist school of Greek philosophy, whom we mostly know through the later writer Sextus Empiricus, tended to teach their followers to suspend judgment, which is a way of saying to train yourself to not believe anything at all. There's also a variety of academic skepticism. The academics are the followers of Plato in the classical world, and we can see a little bit of this skepticism in the writings of Cicero. Skepticism can be found in the Buddhist tradition, and it can be found in the Western medieval tradition. For instance, John Duns Scotus and William of Ockham were engaged in a very lively debate about skepticism and the possibility of knowledge. In the modern era, though, we see a slight turn in skepticism. Instead of viewing skepticism as a position which can be occupied, philosophers started to use skepticism and doubt as a kind of tool in their inquiry. The two most famous examples of this would be René Descartes and David Hume. Descartes uses a method of radical doubt. So Descartes is on a quest for certainty. And what he would do is examine all of his beliefs, and if he could find any reason to doubt them, he would discard his beliefs. What he was searching for were those beliefs which he could know with absolute certainty. He had this idea that once you had identified those fixed truths, then you would be able to build an entire system of knowledge using those truths as a foundation. Because of this, we call Descartes' epistemological project foundationalism. So Descartes uses methodological skepticism to try to identify those foundations. If you know anything about the history of philosophy, then you might have heard the phrase, "I think, therefore I am." This is part of Descartes' foundationalist project. He thinks that that is an inference that he cannot doubt. So the existence of his own mind, which is a thinking thing, proves to be the foundation for Descartes. Descartes would then go on and try to rebuild all of his knowledge. So all of these things that he had previously doubted, like the reliability of our perceptions or the existence of God, he would try to prove using this as a foundation. The other famous modern skeptic would be David Hume, who used his skepticism in a very different sort of way. Where Descartes was a rationalist who believed in the power of human reason to arrive at knowledge, David Hume believed that all human knowledge was based in experience. When we have an experience, this leaves an impression on the mind. And Hume thought that all of our ideas were built out of these simple impressions. And his idea was to use a kind of skeptical methodology to examine our ideas and see if they could have actually been constructed out of impressions based on experience. And if you could not show that such a construction was possible, then you had to actually discard the belief because it was in fact meaningless. Hume famously doesn't believe in induction, which is the belief that the future will be like the past. And that is because he thinks that experience alone cannot prove it. He doesn't believe in causation because he thinks we cannot form the complex idea based on our experiences. He doesn't even believe in the existence of a stable self from one time to another. So Hume and Descartes are both using skepticism in their philosophical methodologies, but they actually diverge pretty wildly on their conclusions. Now, ethics is the study of right and wrong. There are three major schools of ethics. First, we have the consequentialists. Consequentialists believe that you can assess the rightness or wrongness of an action based on the consequences that it produces. Consequentialists tend to have a theory of value that they add, and that allows you to figure out if a consequence is a good consequence or a bad consequence. For instance, the utilitarians, who are closely associated with Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill or Peter Singer, they have a theory of value, and namely that's hedonism. Hedonism is the belief that all that is good is pleasure and all that is bad is pain. When you add hedonism and consequentialism together, you get utilitarianism, which is the moral theory that says that you ought to maximize pleasure. Then we have the deontologists. Deontologists have a law conception of ethics. Instead of talking about the rightness or wrongness of particular actions based on their actual consequences, deontologists like to come up with rules for classes of actions. The most famous deontologist is probably Immanuel Kant. Kant believed that moral law could be deduced from the principles of rationality. So all human beings, as rational creatures, were bound by the same moral law. And in fact, the moral law was knowable because we all should have been able to know it in virtue of our own rationality. But the third school of ethics that we will discuss is a little bit different. That's virtue ethics. Instead of thinking about the rightness or wrongness of particular actions, virtue ethics tends to start by talking about the question of character or the development of virtue. I like to say that virtue ethics really is about how to be a good human being. For virtue ethics, the rightness or wrongness of actions is actually a secondary question. We know that if we become virtuous people, we'll typically do the right thing, so we focus on sort of self-development in an ethical manner. This is a school of ethics that was very popular in ancient Greece and in Rome. You can also find it across the world, especially in the Confucian tradition in Chinese philosophy. You see an emphasis on the development of virtue. The most famous virtue ethicist is probably Aristotle, though. Aristotle wrote this fantastic book, the Nicomachean Ethics, in which outlines a whole theory of virtue and also discusses many of the individual virtues like justice and courage and prudence and temperance, and then eventually goes on to apply this like to living the good life, the life of contemplation, and also discussing what it means to be a good friend in light of virtue. Aristotle very famously thinks that vicious people, people who lack virtue, actually can't be friends. But Aristotle's theory of ethics fell out of favor, and I think this is actually part of a larger downfall of Aristotelian thought in the West. But in the late 1950s, G.E. Anscombe published a paper called Modern Moral Philosophy. That paper is highly critical of the ethical theories of the day. That paper, along with works like Alistair MacIntyre's After Virtue, led to a resurgence of interest in virtue ethics in the academy, and you actually see way more working virtue ethicists now. It's certainly a really robust field of ethics in contemporary philosophy, and even those who maybe say are consequentialists want to discuss virtues in some way in their ethical theories. But you might have this question in the back of your head when I talk about goodness and badness and all of these theories, which is like, isn't all of this ethics stuff kind of bullshit? And if you think the answer to that question is yes, then you're probably a moral nihilist. Now, when some people start to doubt ethics, they can go in two directions. Sometimes they become subjectivist, and they say that ethics is just a matter of subjectivity. What's right for you isn't right for me, something like this. I think this is the wrong path to go down. Subjectivism is very rarely taken seriously in philosophy. I think that it's basically a cop-out, and it doesn't actually wrestle with any of the major problems with realism. The more radical step is to become a moral nihilist and say that there is no such thing as rightness or wrongness. Now, there are many different strands of moral nihilism. One name that gets brought up quite a bit if you talk about nihilism would be Friedrich Nietzsche. But the question of whether or not Nietzsche is a proper nihilist is actually quite contested. Nietzsche was certainly highly critical of conventional morality, especially any morality that was inherited from Christianity, which he thought was a worldview that was dead, was intellectually bankrupt. I'm actually working on a video about Nietzsche and the death of God and all of this stuff, so you could look out for that eventually. But whether or not Nietzsche is a nihilist is actually a matter for some debate among scholars. The question is, when he says that he wants to move beyond good and evil, is he abandoning moral categories, or is he abandoning those specific categories that we've inherited from Christianity? A more contemporary form of nihilism actually comes from the philosopher J.L. Mackie, who wrote this really nice little book called Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong. At the beginning of that book, Mackie gives this argument based on what he calls on queerness. At the time, Mackie meant queerness as strangeness. It was a very common term for something that was strange. Obviously, we say the word queer to mean something a little bit different nowadays, so we'll say the argument from strangeness just to be clear. Essentially, Mackie observes that if moral properties exist, they are the kind of properties that sort of lead to objective prescriptions of action. But no other properties that we know of actually lead to these kinds of objective prescriptions. And so in this way, they are very strange properties. And he says that they are so strange, in fact, that we would be better off just abandoning them in our ontology and say that there is no such thing as an objective prescription. Notice what we've done here, though. We've actually left the realm of ethics. We're no longer talking about whether or not particular actions are right or wrong, or whether or not we are good or bad human beings, and now we're asking foundational questions about ethics. We call this field metaethics. Very roughly, metaethics is the field that asks all those meta questions about ethics, about the language of ethics, about the epistemology of ethics, and about the metaphysics of ethics. So a field that is closely related to ethics is the field of political philosophy. While traditionally ethics focuses on individuals, political philosophy tries to actually deal with human beings at a larger scale. So one of the major issues that we find in political philosophy is the problem of justice, which is closely related to the distribution of wealth. Some philosophers have held that there is a moral imperative for the state to redistribute wealth to make it at least somewhat more equal. And other philosophers have argued that there's actually a moral imperative to not do so, because to do so would infringe on certain rights that individuals have. So to see the differences in these positions, we're going to consider two philosophers really briefly. Those John Rawls and Robert Nozick. These are both 20th century political philosophers, and they're very interesting in part because they were actually both at Harvard's philosophy department at the same time, and they came to such radically different conclusions about what justice demanded. Nozick develops his theory of justice in a book called Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And here, Nozick is developing a very libertarian view of justice. Nozick's theory is sometimes called the entitlement theory. And for our purposes, what's most interesting, though, is that it's a historical theory. So what it does is says that if we want to figure out if our current state of affairs is just, we have to go and trace back all of the steps in history through which property has been acquired and transferred. And when something unjust has happened, has it been rectified? Basically, to see if our current situation is just, we have to look backward and see how did we get here. This is contrasted with Rawls' theory, which he outlines in A Theory of Justice. Rawls bases his theory on something called the veil of ignorance. Now, under this thought experiment, we imagine a group of people, and this group of people are deliberating about what they think a just society would look like. But here's the big catch. They don't know who they're going to be in that society. So they don't know if they'll be men or women, what religion they'll be, if they'll be rich or poor, how smart they'll be, or anything like that. And Rawls says, in that situation, what sort of a society would we prefer? The result is a society that is very different than Nozick's. So Nozick is totally okay with vast amounts of inequality as long as they come about in a just manner. Rawls, on the other hand, thinks that we're going to have a principle that says that all inequality has to be justifiable to those who are least well off. And he thinks that's going to mean we're going to live in a vastly more equal society if we live in accord with these principles. Nozick really is basing a lot of his stuff on property rights, while Rawls thinks that even though you're going to have a lot of rights in his society, perhaps even more rights than we currently enjoy, property rights are something that could be overridden in the name of justice. Another foundational issue in philosophy is democracy. Many of us take for granted that democracy is a good thing. We're happy that we live in democratic societies, and many of our philosophers take for granted that whatever the ideal society is, it's going to be somewhat democratic. But actually, in the history of philosophy, I think this is a minority position. So ancient Greece might have been the place where democracy was born, but both Plato and Aristotle were anti-democratic thinkers. In Plato's Republic, he gives a theory where he prefers the rule by a kind of elite, the philosopher kings. They're intellectually gifted, and their job is to look after the people of the city. And Aristotle actually classifies different kinds of governments, and he classifies some of them as deviant. And on that list of deviant governments are democracies. The worry that Plato and Aristotle both had, I think, is that if you believe in majority rule, you're actually allowing for the tyranny of the majority. Though there is also a kind of elitism both to Plato and Aristotle and many other anti-democratic thinkers. They just think that the people in general are not smart enough or capable enough to rule themselves. This is also another case where you see some parallels with Chinese philosophy. It's taken for granted in a lot of classical Chinese philosophy that there will be a ruling bureaucratic elite or a king who has the mandate of heaven. The issue of democracy isn't really even on the table, so much so that many classical Chinese thinkers aren't even arguing against democracy directly. Another sort of critique of democracy that you find comes from the anarchist tradition. Anarchists historically understood democracy to be a form of majority rule, and this was just another form of tyranny for them. Other anarchists have not been as critical of democracy. In fact, they've sometimes argued that democratic states are not democratic enough, and that truly the most democratic states would be properly anarchist. To understand this, you have to go a little bit far into anarchist theory, and I think that's a little bit too much of a deep dive for a video like this.